Doctor, explain your aims. What are you trying to do here?
Our aim originally was to do research into human health, physical and mental, and to find what needs to be learnt about human work and happiness. Its official title as a friendly society is the Braziers Park School of Integrative Social Research. Our community, by definition, was intended to be a community of unlike minds. One of the most interesting things that I've learned from a community is that it demands that you shall go on growing, and that means that you'll go on changing, so that maybe we do each other an important service in providing a shared environment in which some degree of change and growth is possible. Well, it's a community of people, and nowadays I suppose they would tend to use the word commune, but when we founded it back in 1950, they hadn't thought of using this word commune. You know, it applied to French Revolution or to history in Italy or something like that. Nowadays, it's come into fashion, and we define a community as a group of people that live together and eat together, and we do it all on our own work. In order to bring out the fullness of life, really, you need interplay between unlike minds. That's really one of the things that we started from, and we've tried to live up to that. It's sometimes a bit of a strain. The more unlike minds are, the more difficult it is sometimes. There is a strange kind of slowing up of action which is necessary in a community.
So I went to this travelers meeting, and there was one resident from here talking about braziers. And in South America, we don't have like those kind of communities. So I thought, like, wow, like this is awesome. I should like go and try, because I was always doing like communitarian things during the weekends, but never like living as a community, you know, like in a community. So I thought, this is a good idea. Let's try.
So let's talk about the house. Mark, how many people would you like?
Well, I can put a team together, me,
Yeah.
mine and Darren.
The appeal was intentional community living, and I had heard about it at other intentional communities, because once you start going to a few, you find that a couple of people have been to several others. There's a bit of a community of intentional communities.
Before I came here and knew anything about this place, I went to see a tarot card reader. In the course of the reading, she said, yes, you will live in a place which will be like a church, and it will have a big hill in behind the building. I thought it's interesting, a bit mad, crazy, I didn't really take it seriously. Then I'd been here about a month, and I woke up one morning and I thought, hang on, that was strangely right. So it was like, oh yeah, maybe it's fate. Other times I feel, what I say is that this place calls people in. You know, it's got its own power, its own majesty in a way. And You sometimes feel it sort of scans the world out there and thinks, yep, I'll have that one.
The official opening day of Braziers was Armistice Day 1950. It has long been described as the longest surviving secular community. It is self-contained, but secular doesn't actually represent the mindset of Norman Glaser. He was a late Victorian, born in late Victorian times. He was very self-consciously a Darwinist, as against conventional religion, but he was certainly a spiritual guy. He'd had some progressive, anyway, ideas from the time of his service in the First World War.
He wanted to do what a lot of people thought we should do then, is to try and get people from different countries to come together and talk through their problems rather than just fighting.
It opened in 1950 and my grandfather had German volunteers here. I mean, this is only, 5 years after the end of the war. I mean, in fact, my mum's German. She was one of these volunteers. And I think that shows, for the time, how unconventional my grandfather was.
There are a number of things that have come into the Braziers ethos. One of them was the sensory method, and distinguishing between sensory and executive and giving sensory its say, which I think was really strongly influenced by the experience of the First War. There was this horror of the sacrifices that were being made, these enormous casualties, thousands of men being sent to their deaths by generals who didn't really know what they were doing, or certainly weren't experiencing anything like what was happening. And from that was born, I think, the feeling that there was a need to give the intelligent and the sensitive people their chance of having a say in what was going to happen. And that carried on into the Braziers setup.
We're really talking about sort of, maintaining and running this place week in, week out, year by year. And so we're using it on that sort of scale. But the people who lived here at the beginning of this community, felt that they were leading the way to a new kind of communication where groups can resolve conflict.
The focus that finally led to the founding Braziers was said to have come through the dropping of the atomic bombs.
I'm on this march because I think the time has come for people of every country in the world to express their determination to resist this great menace to the future of our civilization and our mode of life.
If you've got atomic bombs and human communications are as poor and ineffective on the international scale as they seem to be, this is a really horrendous danger, so that this makes our concentration on trying to work out better ways for human groups to communicate.
And as part of the youth in England who are going to live in the future, I felt it was my responsibility to take part in any sort of demonstration which would help stop warfare, and that's why I've come here.
Psychiatrists, psychologists meeting together to, after the horrors of 2 world wars, were taking their responsibility and thinking, well, no, we must come up with suggestions and we must try and improve this. And they were looking for a certain quality. That's why they decided to have a community, because you can't just have a few meetings about this sort of thing or write a few books sitting by yourself. You actually have to put people in the house and sort of enable people to live together. And they were constantly looking for the group mind. So then they suddenly have a feeling where, it wasn't about their own personal input. Somehow they all shared the same notion, the same energy. And I am finding that the sort of processes they're talking about are happening here.
So yeah, that's my room, room 20. And be aware. Yeah, when I came here, first I lived outside the main house. I really like this place, so kind of peaceful most of the times, and I made friends here, and I like when people are coming from around the world. And when I was like younger, I thought, no, I could never live in a community, but now I'm here. I feel free most of the times, because you can choose working days, but sometimes, like when guests are here, you need to work, especially when you're in the kitchen. To me, it feels like that I'm in a dream. Sometimes also a bit too much, because last year was also studying for my herbal medicine course. It was just too much, yeah. I mean, I don't want to stay here forever. Yeah, I think life would be more difficult out there. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, elsewhere. Oh yeah, that one is really nice.
It's only in and through other people that we understand who we are. That's what gives us a sense of worth. What we're busy doing is divorcing ourselves from other people. So there's the idea that we ought to be talking to each other and resolving differences. We appear to outsiders to do a hell of a lot of talking. We talk a lot, but then again there is a lot of action that goes on behind the scenes to some extent. Meals have to be cooked 3 times a day. So there's a lot to be done that can't be avoided. You can't just talk about it.
And it's not as if there isn't much to do, because we have got, a work programme. We did 7 weddings and 4 festivals this year, a lot of retreats, a lot of AGMs, charities come here. Keeping the house in order and cooking and cleaning, it can be quite a lot of stuff. And maintaining an old building, I'm constantly putting putty on windows and painting windows and rooms. You have to be up for this sharing. You're sharing all that wealth, really. You're sharing the value of this whole thing.
There seem to be, a lot of people who have more than they need. You read about these people buying houses for silly money in London and never live in them. And I think the founders of Braziers and my grandparents were right. This consumerism isn't sustainable. The idea was they were hoping that Braziers would replicate itself. So it was more about interconnected local communities making up a global village. So it's anti-globalisation in many respects. We're all connected, but we stay local. We develop for our own needs what's required for our children and families. Everybody has a skill that is used. It's all about how I give more than I take, basically.
When you start working here, you still think in terms of your work time is equal to money time, and it has a value of money. Then after I've been here for just over 2 years, and I'm feeling much more now that, because you don't see the money in connection with the work, you see work as being a different kind of thing. In a sense, this is what I'm just beginning to think is more sort of post-capitalism, if there is ever going to be such a thing. People are talking about it now, where you're sharing work rather than exchanging work for money. In post-capitalism, they talk about coming together socially to exchange work. So you work in somebody else's garden and they come and work in your garden. And so you're sort of gaining something socially, and you're doing work with each other and for each other. And that's what's happening here every single day. And that's a very rich thing.
A very important principle is that it's recognising our context within the world we live in, and that capitalism, competition, divorces us from nature. And people are busy amassing wealth. They think they create security and certainty for at least themselves and their family, but it is an illusion.
When Norman Glaister retired, he was involved with a political party that was formed during the war called Commonwealth, which was a very, very idealistic socialist party.
Commonwealth says that together we can build a new world on new principles, but only if the people are prepared to work for that world. The system under which we have to live is not only immoral, it just will not work. Common ownership is necessary because fellowship is impossible in the daily working lives of men and women, while the industrial life of the community is directed from the top in the interest of profit. Big business holds the whip hand politically until the people have declared for common ownership as a whole. The squabbling nations of Europe must be united under a European federal government. By this means alone is peace likely to be preserved. If you wish to return to unemployment queues, want and misery, and the country increasingly run by ever-growing big business, vote Tory. That way lies fascism and war. If you are prepared to work for a new world run on principles of fellowship, vote Commonwealth. Or where no Commonwealth candidate is standing, for another socialist candidate.
The Commonwealth Party wasn't about the colonial empire. It was about literally sharing wealth. And it was the idea that property should be shared. And it was actually lived out by Norman Glaister. So when he leaves this place in his will, it's to all people who want to come and live here as a community. It's a phenomenal thing to do. The Commonwealth Party was where Norman Glaister was accepted. And so they started practicing his process of sensitive resistive.
The sensory is a process. So unlike other intentional communities where they would just have a weekly kind of touching base meeting, that's not really what we have. Sensory is quite specific. And I'm only just starting to understand what sensory is.
In a sensory meeting, we might have an agenda of things which are things that anybody can write down that they would like talked about. We don't call it an agenda, we call it a contemplanda, because it's things that we're going to contemplate. We're not things we're going to make decisions about, which is very helpful to the sub-ex meeting that happens later. When we have to actually make the decisions, and at sub-ex, if we're divided and we're unsure what to do, we can send it back to sensory and have another go at it, you know?
Well, they're not just groups, they're also personality traits. That isn't to say that everyone is categorized into one or the other. But there's in some way useful to know. Are you a sensory person? Are you an executive? Or sometimes we would call executives resistive people.
I think I don't believe like there are people like that is one or the other. I think like me, there are people that maybe is more executive or more sensory, but I think we can be both, to be honest.
There's a dynamic between the sensory and executive. There's a tension between them because they kind of, although they're part of the same whole, they're kind of pulling in different directions. Some people criticise it, say, well, if only we resolve the tension, it would be all right. And so, well, you know, I think you've missed the whole point. Without the tension, it doesn't exist. In terms of the human body, we've got a hard exterior and a soft interior. Part of us craves adventure, but the other part's concerned with safety. But there's a dilemma between the two.
there's two sides happening, where you can be both extremes. I mean, really amused me actually, because one of my daughters gave me a card just to put on the board here, and it was of a group in some kind of talking session, and she obviously felt that this was what kind of summarised Braziers a bit, and it was the person facilitating the session saying to the group around the table, just feel free to say whatever you want to say, just as you wish to say it, that kind of thing, So from the other side of the table comes, fuck you. And that was somehow summarised it for her. And I thought, well, I'm not going to argue. I'm not sure, but it's interesting. So it's almost like release. You are released. But of course you're not, because if we were all released, it would be absolute chaos. And it can get chaotic,
This is Garden Cottage. The right-hand room is now Joe's room. He used to be a resident here, but he works full-time outside now. And then the green door will lead into a room on the left, which is used for volunteers. And then my place is at the back. I'll show you that. I sometimes have people to come and stay, and they sleep in this room, and I sleep next door. And this is my size. I use this for cutting grass. It's a wonderful way. It takes practice, but I've had quite a lot of practice over many years, and it's a very satisfying way of cutting grass, as long as you don't try to do too much at once. That's a picture of one of my daughters and her two sons in New Zealand, and this is my Buddha, and he has a little message there. It's pause for inspiration in the midst of everyday life. The 4 decisions: pause, step back, step aside, let inspiration guide, pause. The decision to stop in this moment. Step back, the decision to get out on my own. Step aside, the decision to invite inspiration within to help. Let inspiration guide, the decision to choose my inspired mind by accepting the wisdom of inspiration. And I thought that my Buddha would be a good man to look after that little thing. Through here is my room. These are my books, lots and lots of books. That's one of my daughters, and her son is now a young man. I came here on the 14th of September 2009, and so it's getting on for 8 years. I came from another community in Dorset, and it took me a couple of years to find somewhere where they'd have me. I was 79 at the time, not a very good candidate for a community. I think I was a lonely child, and I read a book by R.M. Lockley, and the book was called Inland Farm. There was a photograph in the book of all the people having breakfast just as we do on a long table, and I thought, that's how I want to live. I don't spend much time up here. I sleep here, and when I get up early in the morning, and so I often have a break during the day, but otherwise I live in the house.
Some of the founders of the community were interested in the camping movements that happened between the wars. Groups like the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry, a strange group that was basically Quakers who were rediscovering folklore and folk religion, and they're interested in the sort of pagan gods and rituals within nature. And here we have a door knocker, which is a ram, which is a symbol of Satan in pagan culture. So the door knocker's still around from about 1950. This building was built right at the beginning of the Neo-Gothic, and that literature actually enmeshes with architecture at this time. So they're not building a house to live in, they're building a fantasy. They're sort of thrilled by fear. It's like a film set, it's like being in a play. Of course, the problem with that is people's fears become real. So when you play with anything, with your imagination, it can take you a little bit further than where you thought. Or you might actually encounter the things that you are frightened of by being receptive to them. So, here's the old library. It's just stacked with all sorts of, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, the older stuff, Montessori on education. It's always got this social sort of aspect to it, groups, the human group. All these questions on these books is what they were really exploring. So here you have an introduction to organic philosophy, the perfectibility of man, the evolution of human consciousness, man in search of himself, the natural history of the mind, the imprisoned splendour. Fantastic. So those are the sort of things that they're immersing themselves in. Pain, sex and time. There's a lot here. Oh my God. A new model of the universe, Ouspensky. So they're on to Gurdjieff here. That's. I often talk to people, are you looking at Gurdjieff? Because he had a community in Paris, in the Prieuré, outside Paris. And he did all sorts of dances and endurance tests, and he was interested in sleeplessness, so sleep deprivation. And he was interested in fasting for days and then having massive feasts. And if they're looking at anything like this, then they're really up for some, challenges. There's always a sort of thread of the esoteric going on, but it's not what you would call New Age, like in Findhorn. It's just basically all of that research of that time put together, the psychology, sociology, some esoteric strands, some pagan folklore. They wanted to set up their own folk religion, It's the sort of thing that they wrote about. A bit of absolutely everything, not ruling things out. The area that Norman Glaister is interested in is what would be called now sociobiology. And the idea is all about that people in groups actually form and behave as an organism.
In the same way as the cells of the body have become increasingly specialised and differentiated, it was at least an interesting hypothesis that actual human beings could increasingly, to some degree, subsume their individuality and become primarily parts of a functioning human organism, which you could see would be a multi-mental organism, or in more popular terms, more threatening terms, it could be a group mind. From all we can see about evolution so far, this is on the cards as a possibility. That original statement of Ames, of Lorna's, that has that vital word, to make conscious in ourselves the shape of the process of which we are part, in order that we may facilitate its development more effectively. That sounds like quite a good stab at describing the function of human beings in the universe, doesn't it? The obvious defining characteristic of human beings is consciousness. And consciousness was the absolute raison d'etre of the setting up of Braziers.
We've gone beyond an animal existence to something that relies on how we relate to each other.
Here's the second one.
Ah, what does it say?
Rest and be thankful.
Okay. Oh, I like that one.
And Braziers is all about intentional relationship and promoting the gregarious habit and cooperation, not competition.
What was last year?
It's about living a life whole that will contribute to the art of living and the science of life. So the resident community gains its legitimacy from being a social experiment.
The aim was really a sociological experiment. We wanted to do research to see what really are the optimum conditions for human living, especially human health, mental and physical. At the heart of it all is how to live effectively and in a worthwhile way this life on Earth.
One thing that was said at the beginning was said, if this is the right approach, but we've made a mistake, it will be self-correcting, it will correct itself. But then you look at the evidence and you say, well, it's only changed very little. In a social context, development is the equivalent to evolution. So we talk about developing rather than evolving. And I think we've developed very little. Because of the way Glyn managed Braziers, he's developed a cultural tradition that's strong enough to keep us here until such a time, in my view, that we can start to accelerate that change. There hopefully will come a point in time. I think we're still embryonic in terms of the way the analogy works.
One of Alexander Trocchi's statements was, how to begin. At a chosen moment, in a vacant house, mill, abbey, church or castle, not too far from the City of London, we shall foment a kind of cultural jam session. Out of this will evolve the prototype of our spontaneous university. You get this event that happens here, the Sigma weekend, where R.D. Laing shows up, and Alexander Trocchi, and they're talking about some sort of cultural big shift, a big change. Intellectual psychiatrists, sociologists, writers, actors, artists, they were setting up a sort of British version of the situation that's going on in France. So some of our education events after this have used these terms, like the spontaneous university, and several of our discussion groups have been in this sort of nature of a jam session.
John Latham, he'd built one of these Scoob Towers of books. Yes, a sort of hollow chimney made of books. And this was made to be burnt, and it was burnt out on the terrace wall. That culminated in the perpetration of the notorious black spot on the drawing room wall by John Latham, you see. We've got a photograph of how it was. At some point, very late in the evening, when these respectable people had gone to bed, this wall he just used it as a canvas. He'd got a terrific tube of very, very, very black spray paint, and he'd done an enormous sort of oval of black spray paint. There, this sort of point on the edge of the oval. He'd splayed the pages of the book out and plonked them into this plaster of Paris, a sort of pre-punctuation to the black dots. This spray paint made quite a smell, which gradually percolated into the house. So a few people during the night realised he'd done it. That brief film includes the Sunday morning breakfast, at which Latham, among others, is very present, and he's looking like a hunted hare. He looks extremely jumpy and extremely nervous. It caused great distress to some of the older ladies who were part of the Braziers community at that time.
Nobody liked it, but it actually took them 5 years to paint over it.
Yes, it was discussed in a very sensory way over at least 2 years, maybe 3. And it was then resolved, yes, it should be taken down, even though we knew some people viewed it as a precious piece of modern art.
It should have been what they wanted to do. It's quite interesting, isn't it? It's like they would have, I'm sure, certainly with R.G. Lang and the like, they would have welcomed this group. This was a group that was actually really going to, really doing what Braziers ought to, the meat of the stuff the Braziers ought to. And yet they were altogether far too shocking. I prefer to be on the side of edgy, fringy things of making a difference to a few people than in the establishment, making no difference to anybody. Norman met Dorothy through the old Woodcross chivalry. Dorothy already had these threads of democratic education, the Kibber Kift. All those early woodcraft movements is simply you simplify things in order to achieve a self-reliance, an inner strength, and an ability to sort of self-educate. They did work with the Griffith, with unemployed men. The Q camps with people with mental health problems was again about planned environment therapy, about the group work and the self-determination within the space, but the space really mattered, the fact that they were outside.
You will find the men of the first Grith Fyrd, or Peace Army Camp, which was launched in 1932. These camps are small, self-governing communities where young men of all classes can develop themselves both physically and mentally. They have felled trees, trimmed the logs, and with them built sleeping and dining shelters, which are in use all the year round. The temporary erections will later be replaced by cob buildings like this, built in the traditional style of the neighbourhood. They weave the cloth for their own lumber jackets on homemade looms. Classes of various kinds are held in the open by members of the community for the benefit of their colleagues. Using wood fuel and an improvised oven, they have mastered the art of cooking. But when the gong sounds for dinner, well, there's no stopping them.
Griff pioneers now. So I'm a warden and a trustee. Yeah, it used to be Griff feared, which I think means peace camp in Old English. They'll basically live in the woods and cook in the woods and being closer to nature. We'd often get left here as children and our parents wouldn't be here, and the same used to happen at the woods, and it didn't matter because it was almost like a big family. So you could end up here for weeks without your parents. Yeah. A lot of freedom. I had a lot of trouble fitting in at school, for instance, because for me, if you were cold and there was a jacket on a peg, you'd borrow it. You'd put it on because you were cold, and you'd bring it back and put it back on the peg later. Now, it didn't go down very well in school. When somebody would say, "They're my shoes," you say, "Yeah, but I'm going to give them back."
This is Dorothy Glaister's book, Chiron's Cave. It's an extremely progressive book about education. Children would be taught outside. They were interested in something called hardihood, and children in the middle of January were encouraged to take their clothes off and stand in the woods naked and to see how long they could stick it out. There's a photograph of them here where they're enduring the cold. It's a completely voluntary exercise. Children could start or stop whenever they wanted, but they would just bear it until they were numb with cold as a sort of personal challenge to themselves. So these days that would be seen as a horrifically cruel thing to do with children. The point of this is that it's about endurance and developing hardihood and understanding your environment through the challenges that it throws up. When she was training teachers how to become teachers, she did something which she called the vigil of the fire. A young adult would be encouraged to stay up all night staring at a fire and then go to work the next day without telling anybody that they'd been up all night, and have a completely normal day and then go home and go to bed exhausted. So it's taking on personal challenges and making them your own business and your own personal development.
Okay, so this is the walled garden. It's the main part of the growing area. So it's south facing, so it gets a lot of sun. It doesn't have any water points in it, so watering's quite an issue, but I've tried to solve that by having made 2 water harvesting systems. So the rainwater that falls on the porta cabin roof over there and the campsite shower roof over there behind the wall is collected and stored, and then it comes through the wall into the garden. So we have 2 rainwater taps in the garden, which I'm very proud of. This garlic is just starting to peek up through the ground, and I'm waiting to see whether the lines are straight or not, because I asked a very inexperienced volunteer to do some of the lines, and she completely forgot where she'd planted and things. Doesn't really matter if they're not in straight lines, but it looks better, and if they're all wonky, then someone will think I've done it. This is the bean tunnel. It needs a bit of repair at the moment, but the idea is that beans grow up every pole, and when it's time to harvest them you can walk through. structures and shapes in the garden. It's called a Huggle Bed, so it's a German word for a small hill, and it's just basically burying rotten, decomposing wood in the soil to kind of mimic the kind of fertility of a forest floor and years of dead wood building up and decaying and things. So you can almost see it as a kind of miniature landscape, a mountain range, and choose where you think the best place for the different plants are. Some plants will do better on the top of the ridges, where it's a bit drier, maybe more sun, and then other things will do better in the furrows. And it acts as a kind of sponge to keep the water top of the bed for longer, and obviously a great source of nutrients to improve the fertility and the soil structure for many years to come. There's evidence in other cultures besides ours of doing this thousands of years ago.
This is the edge of Braziers estate. Yeah, I like to think about this place as the edge of the universe, really, so the liminal zone between the known and the unknown. So it's really nice to have this connection, and sometimes I feel there is a stream of energy coming from the earth and through the sweat lodge and passing through this walk we had just done, and going through the house and going up towards the sky. So welcome. So you wanna come in, take a look? Yeah, it's very small and comfy, cozy. Yes, just what I need really. But yeah, I think I like this small place and in relation with the majesty of the house. It's good to create that separation in a way. You realize other different things, and it's really good to have a deep connection with nature. If you are all the time there, you get absorbed easily and you don't realize the passing of time, and you don't have time to reflect on yourself. I think I developed a relationship with my own landscape in a way, so my inner world has become much more important. Which I think we have forgotten in this era, to give value to our inner world. Well, that's my kibokif symbol. So this kibokif movement was born in relationship with the forest school camp and the scouts. So it's parallel, and they have symbols. So that's my owl, and this I don't know. I really love it, and it means a lot for me, in a way, and it's kind of symbol of vision and inner vision and night vision. I used to kind of look at the moon through this little alabaster bowl. In a way, you can keep the moon inside your place, inside your space. And that's a little microcosm in my caravan. Yeah, I don't know. It's a kind of humble sensation being here, in a way that you are at the same level of the rest. In the house it's like, okay, you have in this elitarian place, and you feel a bit like above. I don't know. I have these sensations. And here, if you're not humble and understand other living beings and their purpose, you cannot fight with nature here, or you will. I mean, nature will kill you if you start to fight.
I don't know, other communities define themselves like the technological place, the permacultural place. Braziers never like has this like a name, and I think on purpose we don't want to have that, you know, we don't want to be only one thing. It's this thing which is wonderful about Braziers as well, like so because of that the marketing is not working very well, you know. It is, we can't say one thing. It's just like, yeah, we are a community and we are a struggle to say what we are and what we are doing, because and mainly we can define ourselves because, yeah, we have this business and it's not a cooperative, what we do between us. It's a little difficult, yeah.
When I meet people outside, they can have sort of preconceptions about the place. That, you know, it's a bunch of hippies and not very savoury and not adequately right wing. We live in quite a right wing part of the world here. They kind of have a perception of the place, you know, so they don't really ask you. You know, it's like, oh, you live there, right? But this place just laughs and says, who cares? Does it matter? The fact is something is going on. And in a way, there's a lot more going on here than probably has ever been recognised. And in a way, the place is a mystery.
Just by living here is a sustainable act, because, you know, supposing all these people who live here had a house each, you know, how much resources would we need? You know, the commonest number of people at the dining table is 11. And in a normal house that would be a party, wouldn't it? We'd do this twice a day, you know.
And that element, you know, now that it is, or it probably always has been, but it is so multinational now, just not, you know, not only with the volunteers, you know, here, but also with the residents, that you sort of feel, I sort of feel like I don't have to go anywhere because the world is coming to me. Not a good idea, but, and I would like to go somewhere, but the world comes here a lot, you know.
All over the world there are people who feel they've got a little home here, an emotional home. So we've got this wide community. And then we've got a resident community at any one time, a resident community who are, you know, take on the responsibility of continuing the experiment. But then there's a sort of a wider, but not massively wide, community of people who are members or associates. Members often hold a lot of the memories.
There is people living here for a long time, but it's now like 2 years, 3 years, and maybe in the past the people being like stay here for 10 years, 20 years, and that changed all the dynamic of the decisions. I left the community 1 month ago, so it's been very difficult to me to say why. But I think as a group of residents I was feeling that we weren't empowered. Yeah. Now, the most challenging thing that I found here was the decision making by consensus, because like in the theory, great, the consensus, but when you have to take decisions and do something practically, and we are like round and round and round, and it's very contemplative. It's good to know like the opinion of everyone, but I feel very frustrated about that process. Sometimes I was like about to cry, you know, after meetings. I was like, please take a decision, or, you know. Although I think as well I left this place because was the cycle was finished, and I really enjoy this place, and I come back, it's like my family. So. No, I have the feeling that now is the time to Braziers to go out. Braziers been like very inside and like hidden, and probably is now the time to go out and show the world what we've been doing here. We are known in the media because of festivals and events and those things, but not really as a community.
There would be no satisfaction or sense of well-being unless it was somehow shared, or and not just sharing what we can influence in other people in the world, but bringing the influences of the world in and seeing what effect that people with different approaches or different dynamics have.
Your perception of the world is constantly changing and constantly being revised because you're in constantly new situations, and people are constantly changing here, but particularly as they come and go. But I think, everybody leaves a bit of their spirit here, so everybody has an impact on this environment because it's in a receptive environment, it's absorbing the environment. If you're not too kind of ego-focused with your consciousness, then there's more chance for people to co-connect, isn't there? In a mutually productive and sharing way. But I think that it's a development of consciousness, maybe, which sounds a bit grand, but I think that may be what it is.
Old buildings last a lot longer than people. I mean, you look at that old house, all the different people that have lived in it and the different ethoses. It's a mosaic, isn't it? Just as the house itself becomes a mosaic.